Well,
Yeah.
I don't think, unfortunately, Mitch McConnell's not going to lose, but we would have had we would have had a hell of a race if Booker was the nominee.
Much better shot.
Oh my!
I mean, I think there's.
I mean, a much better shot, and also just an intrinsically valuable race. I mean, a much better shot, and something that would have clarified the stakes on any number of levels. But
you would have had a better shot. I don't know that he could win, but you would also build an infrastructure in Kentucky around a guy who's much more dynamic and is going to bring in much more excitement and much more voters that are going to be lasting in an era when maybe people aren't voting against Donald Trump, but they're actually voting for something affirmative.
Exactly.
And you could have nationalized that race a lot more.
100%.
Without a doubt.
That would have been the most.
Without a doubt.
I mean, look, presidency is presidency, so it's most important. But that would have been the most crucial race in the country, without a doubt.
Chuck Schumer. I mean, I don't. Who knows what Chuck Schumer's intent was in this? If it was just to get somebody in office who's going to win, who's going to be to the right of him, because it makes it much easier, or if it's also just part of a broader plan where he's just so incapable of having any type of political imagination that a female vet just sounds too perfect to him. Or if it's also maybe like, there was a time where the Red Sox, they would sacrifice winning the World Series to get into the playoffs. In other words, we can't afford to have a full rebuilding year because we want to keep people's interest through the playoffs. But because we're not going to do a rebuilding year, we'll never get to the World Series. And I'm not convinced that Chuck Schumer's like, we're going to have a playoffs and Mitch McConnell will be protected. Like, Amy McGrath has definitionally a ceiling because there's just not enough of those votes in a place like Kentucky to go and fishing in Republican waters. And that's what she was trying to do. Right? She was trying to say, like, I'm going to work with Donald Trump.
More than Mitch McConnell. That's what she said in her opening, her first interview. Yeah.
But speaking of Mitch McConnell, here is Mitch McConnell. And I will tell you this, like Joe Manchin has already come out and said, I'm not going to get rid of the filibuster. But guys like Coons are starting to, articulate a chance of it. And all of these candidates, to be fair, who are running for, Senate seats, Democratic candidates, are entertaining the idea of a filibuster. Here's Mitch McConnell trying to basically threaten Democrats, don't start thinking about this. And folks, you can listen to this and then you can try and guess what my response is to Mitch McConnell.
Senator, can I ask you, some Democratic senators are already discussing getting rid of the legislative filibuster if they win the Senate. What is your response to that? And also, if you keep the majority, will you consider getting rid of the legislative filibuster?
Well, I consistently said no to the current president on that issue, and he tweeted about me a number of times, which I greatly appreciated. And let me say, I think the important thing for our Democratic friends to remember is that you may not be in total control in the future. And anytime you start fiddling around with the rules of the Senate, I think you always need to put yourself in the other fellow's shoes and just imagine what might happen when the winds shift. With regard to the changes that have occurred on the executive calendar, really that's a very recent phenomenon. Even though it was possible on the executive calendar to filibuster nominees, it just wasn't done until Bush 43 got elected. And ironically, the current Democratic leader of the Senate was the ringleader in starting to filibuster on the executive calendar. And then Senator Reid undid that. And where we are today on the executive calendar is right back where we were for 200 years prior to Bush 43. So that's not really a revolution. What would be a revolution is to turn the Senate into the House, would be to change the legislative filibuster. I'm not through. So do I feel strongly about it? You bet. And if there are any responsible Democratic senators left who aren't going to be stampeded by the hard left, they ought to take a pause and think about whether they really think it's a good idea for the for the country to put the one institution that guaranteed that America stayed in the middle of the road into the same place as the House.
You know, honestly, the short answer I have for Mitch McConnell is go F yourself. The idea that he's not even bringing up, Merrick Garland, the idea that he's not bringing up the fact that they got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. It is time. And the Senate will never be the House until there is some measure of democracy in the way that senators are elected. The fact of the matter is that the idea that, people in the size of of half a borough in New York control more votes than, all of New York City, the number of votes that are controlled. Well, we have a situation in the Senate. Simply, you can put it this way. Something like 46% of the country, dominates the Senate. It doesn't make any sense. And so it's never going to be the House because it's never going to be elected with such a level of democracy. But if you're going to introduce any measure of democratic reform, small d democratic reform, the way you do that is by getting rid of the filibuster. And fine, if Mitch McConnell wants to sit atop legislation, it is time to that is revanchist and regressive. Let them own it. Let them own it. Absolutely. It is time for masks off, and this is going to increase accountability. It will still provide folks like Joe Manchin. That's why Joe Manchin, I would love there to be no filibuster. If the Democrats take the Senate with like 1 or 2 votes, Joe Manchin is he's the man. He's loving it because he's suddenly the fulcrum. He's the guy who can make or break any type of these Democratic initiatives. So it would give him a lot of power. So, but Mitch McConnell, go after yourself. Any Democrat senator who listens to Mitch McConnell's warnings at this point is a fool or lying. Period.
Yes, that Manchin, that'll be like 3/4 horrifying corporate giveaways, and 1/4 like West Virginia is going to get the bacon, man. Woo.
Yeah, exactly.
that guy knows how to. He knows how to play that angle. That's why he's such a survivor.
Hey, let's